The laundry on the creek ford stones told the story. 4 baskets, belonging to 4 different households, held linen that had been washed in the freezing water and hung to dry inside their cabins overnight. It was stiff as pine planking. Every sheet and shirtwaist was a sculpture of frost, the fabric bonded solid by the ice that had formed within its own fibers. It would have to be thawed near the fire, carefully, to prevent tearing. This was the known physics of January in the Wabash Valley. Then there was Sarah's basket. Her linen, folded loose and dry, was soft. It moved with the slight breeze coming off the frozen creek. It smelled of soap and wood smoke, not the metallic bitterness of ice. Mrs. Caudle, the postmaster's wife, picked up one of Sarah's pillowcases. She worked it between her raw, red fingers. It was pliable. It was textile. It was simply dry. The other women stopped their work, their own frozen laundry forgotten. The sight was impossible, a violation of the rules of winter. In 1864, in a cabin heated by a wood fire, you could have warmth or you could have dry air, but you could not have both. Every drop of moisture boiled from the kettle or breathed from human lungs found the coldest surface and clung to it as frost. To dry laundry indoors was to freeze it indoors. Yet here was proof to the contrary. "Where did you hang this, Sarah?" Mrs. Caudle asked, her voice low and sharp with suspicion. Sarah, a war widow who boarded with the Pritchard woman, simply pointed back up the path toward the small claim on the rise. "By the wall," she said. The source of that impossible warmth, the reason for that soft linen, was smeared 1.5 inches thick over every interior log of Hannah Pritchard's cabin. It was a plaster made from cow dung, water, and slaked lime. The women at the creek ford knew this. The entire settlement knew it. They had smelled it curing all through the late summer. They had talked about it on their porches, discussed it after services, and held their noses when the wind was right. They called it foolishness, filth, and an invitation to every worm and rat in Indiana. They pitied the poor widow Sarah for having to live in it. Now, in the heart of a brutal freeze, that same foul plaster had produced a small, quiet miracle on laundry day. A miracle that was forcing them to question everything they thought they knew about keeping a body warm. I'm going to tell you the story of Hannah Pritchard, and I promise that by the end of it, you will understand the physics of why a material everyone dismissed as waste became one of the most effective insulation and air sealing systems on the frontier. You will learn about thermal mass, fibrous insulation, and the chemistry of lime. And in return for that knowledge, all I ask is that you take a moment to click the subscribe button and leave a comment below. Let us know about an old technique or piece of wisdom from your own family's history. We read everyone. Hannah Pritchard was not a frontierswoman in the way the Wabash Valley understood the term. She was not the wife of a corn farmer or a hog drover. She was not born to the rhythms of breaking sod and planting bottomland. Before Indiana, her world had been the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania, in a small Welsh dairy settlement near Ebensburg. Her hands were shaped not by an axe handle, but by the worn wood of a milking stool, the cold steel of a milk pail in winter, and the smooth, familiar curve of her father's plastering trowel. She was a dairy smallholder's daughter. Her father, Owain, was a man who understood the bond between an animal's health and the quality of its shelter. He was a byre builder, a constructor of cow barns, and his reputation rested on a simple fact. Owain Pritchard's calves did not die in the winter. While other farmers lost newborns to the damp, lung-seizing cold, his remained healthy. The secret was not in the logs he used, but in what he coated them with. He used a thick, fibrous plaster of lime and dung to seal the byre's walls. From the age of 11, Hannah was his apprentice. She learned the feel of the mix, the exact shade of gray-green that meant the consistency was right. She learned the smell of lime as it slaked, a clean, sharp scent that cut through the heavier odor of the dung. Her father had a tool, a wooden trowel gauge he'd made himself, marked with a notch for the perfect 1.5-inch thickness. Before every new coat of plaster, he would tap it twice on his hip, a small, unconscious ritual of readiness. Hannah picked up the habit. She carried that same gauge now, tucked into the belt of her work dress, its wood darkened by the oils of 2 sets of hands. The tension between them was not in the work, but in the world beyond it. Owain saw her future tethered to the dairy, married to a local boy, her life unfolding within the familiar hills of Cambria County. Hannah saw the maps in the newspapers, the talk of quarter sections of land available for any soul brave enough to claim them. She wanted her own place. He called it foolish. A woman alone? On the frontier? You are a dairymaid, Hannah, not a man with an axe. Their argument was a low, simmering thing that lasted for years, a clash of love and ambition. It ended without resolution when he died of a lung fever in the spring of '62. After burying him, Hannah sold her small inheritance of 2 milk cows, packed his batch notes in oilcloth and his trowel gauge in her bag, and went west. She arrived in the Wabash Valley with enough money for a claim and the logs for a 1-room cabin with a sleeping loft. The community, a tight-knit settlement of 38 Hoosier Methodist households, watched her with a mixture of curiosity and deep-seated skepticism. A single woman on her own claim was an anomaly. When she took in Sarah, the young widow of a man lost at Chickamauga, the anomaly became a permanent topic of conversation. The 2 women, with no man on the place, were a puzzle the settlement could not solve, and so they mostly talked about it among themselves, their judgment hardening with every telling. The cabin Hannah built was standard, sturdy, and indistinguishable from any other. It was what she planned to do to the inside of it that would set her truly and completely apart. Their first winter, from 1863 to '64, was a lesson in conventional failure. The cabin, built of green pine logs, began to shrink as it dried. Tiny gaps, called checks, opened up along the grain of the wood. The daubing of mud and moss they'd packed between the logs was a good start, but it did nothing for the wood itself. The wind, sweeping across the flat river-bottom land, found every one of those new fissures. It was a quiet, insidious cold. There was no single, roaring draft. Instead, the air itself in the cabin seemed to be in constant, subtle motion. On a windy day, the simple calico curtain Hannah had hung over the single window would lift gently at its corner, moved by a breath of air that seemed to come from the solid wall itself. Every nailhead driven into the logs became a point of thermal transfer, gathering the cold and displaying it as a perfect white bead of interior frost. Sarah, sleeping in the loft, took to wearing her heavy wool coat to bed. The cold radiating from the roof and walls was too much for her thin quilt. They fed the small iron stove constantly. Survival was measured in wood. They burned through a cord, a stack of wood 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, every 10 days. Hannah would watch the woodpile shrink with a growing sense of dread, the stack diminishing far faster than the calendar pages turned. It was an unwinnable race against the season. She saw the same struggle in every other household. Smoke plumed constantly from every chimney. The sound of axes splitting wood was a daily percussion across the valley. Men complained at the post office about the endless work of feeding the stove. Women traded remedies for chilblains and coughs. They were all living the same reality. A log cabin was a sieve. It could hold back the snow, but it could not hold the heat. They fought the winter by burning more and more of it, turning acres of forest into fleeting warmth. Hannah knew this was a fool's bargain. She had her father's notes, she had his gauge, and she had the memory of warm, healthy calves sleeping soundly in a Pennsylvania byre. In the late summer of 1864, as the corn began to dry on the stalk, Hannah began her work. She traded a neighbor for 3 wagon loads of fresh manure from his cattle pen. The neighbor, a farmer named Silas Croft, shook his head as he helped her unload it. "Whatever you're planning, Hannah, that's a powerful stink to be bringing so close to home." She just nodded and handed him the agreed-upon price. She mixed the dung with water in a large wooden trough until it was a thick, fibrous slurry. Then she added the slaked lime she'd purchased in town. The smell was earthy and overwhelming. It clung to her clothes and hair. News of her project traveled faster than the scent. The opposition was diffuse, a chorus of voices from different corners of the settlement. Mrs. Caudle was the first. "It's unnatural," she declared to a small audience at the post office. "Bringing barn filth into a Christian home. It will draw flies in the summer and vermin in the winter. Mark my words." Another neighbor, Jedediah Hale, stopped by on his way back from the grist mill. He leaned on the fence, watching her work for a long moment. "I tried banking my smokehouse with dung one year," he offered, his voice heavy with the certainty of experience. "Thought it'd hold the heat for the cure. It rotted the bottom logs clean through in 2 seasons. The whole structure stank so bad of mold you couldn't stand to be near it. That stuff bores into the sap channels, Hannah. It'll poison your wood." At the creek ford, 3 of the settlement wives spoke just loud enough for Sarah to hear as she filled her water buckets. Poor thing. First her husband, now this, living in a stable. Even Reverend Yoakum weighed in from the pulpit, not mentioning Hannah by name, but preaching a sermon on the clear and necessary separation between the world of man and the world of beasts, and the importance of cleanliness in the home as a reflection of purity in the soul. Through it all, Hannah worked. She ignored the stares, the whispers, the well-meaning and ill-intentioned advice. Her focus was on the mix, on the memory in her hands. Sarah was her only partner, her quiet presence a bulwark against the town's disapproval. She helped haul the water and turn the mixture, her face set with a grim loyalty. Then came the moment. The interior walls were bare, the logs showing their age, the checks like fine lines on an old face. Hannah took a deep breath, the familiar scent of the mixture filling her lungs. She reached for her father's trowel gauge, its wooden handle smooth against her palm. She tapped it twice on her hip. A small sound, barely audible, a ritual of connection, a prayer to a memory. She knelt, dipped the trowel into the bucket Sarah was holding steady, and laid the first stroke. It went on smooth and thick, the dark, fibrous plaster filling the space between 2 logs, covering the wood in a seamless coat. As she worked, a buggy slowed on the road that ran past her claim. It was the schoolmistress, Miss Albright. She did not stop. She simply slowed her horse to a walk, her gaze fixed on the open cabin door, on the woman inside methodically smearing cattle dung over her walls. Then, with a small shake of her head, she flicked the reins and drove on. The judgment was silent, but absolute. Hannah kept working. What the schoolmistress and the rest of the Wabash Valley saw was filth. What they failed to see was a sophisticated 2-part thermal system. Hannah wasn't just coating her walls. She was fundamentally changing how they interacted with heat and air. The genius of her father's method lay in its dual function, addressing the 2 great enemies of a warm cabin: air leakage and heat conduction. The first function was air sealing. A log wall is not a solid barrier. As the wood cures, it shrinks and splits, creating dozens, even hundreds, of tiny cracks and checks. In a standard cabin, these fissures act as channels for cold air to infiltrate the structure. It's not a draft you can easily find and plug. It's a slow, persistent bleed of energy. The dung and lime plaster addressed this perfectly. The mixture, with its high content of undigested cellulose fibers from the cattle's diet of grass and hay, acted as a fibrous mat. When Hannah troweled it onto the walls with firm pressure, she was forcing this fibrous slurry deep into every last check and crevice. It was more effective than chinking because it was monolithic, a single, continuous membrane covering the entire interior surface. Weighing approximately 80 pounds per cubic foot, the dense plaster formed an airtight barrier that wine simply could not penetrate. The gentle lifting of the curtain she had witnessed the winter before was a problem that now ceased to exist. The second function was insulation. This is where the dung itself was critical. Those same cellulose fibers that sealed the cracks also created millions of microscopic air pockets within the plaster as it dried. This is the fundamental principle of all insulation: trapping still air. A single solid material, like a log, conducts heat. Heat from the stove warms the inside of the log, and that energy naturally travels through the solid wood to the colder outside surface, where it is lost to the winter air. But the tiny pockets of air trapped in the fibrous plaster were poor conductors. They dramatically slowed the rate at which heat could escape through the walls. The 1.5-inch layer of plaster added a significant R value, a measure of thermal resistance, to the entire wall assembly. Hannah had effectively wrapped the inside of her home in a thick, insulating blanket. Finally, there was the matter of the stench and the fear of rot, the objections raised by her neighbors. This is where the lime was the silent hero. The neighbors saw dung, but the mixture was nearly half lime. Slaked lime, or calcium hydroxide, is highly alkaline, with a pH of around 12.4. This caustic environment is hostile to bacteria, mold, and insects. As the plaster cured over 6 weeks, the lime neutralized the volatile organic compounds in the dung that cause odor. The initial barnyard smell slowly faded, replaced by a clean, earthy scent like a damp cellar or a freshly tilled garden. The high pH also acted as a powerful wood preservative, preventing the mold and rot that Jedediah Hale had warned of. His dung-banked smokehouse had failed because it was just dung, organic, wet, and acidic. Hannah's plaster was a chemical system, a stable, breathable, and protective layer. She hadn't brought the barn into her house. She had brought the science of the buyer. That winter, the Ohio Valley fell into the grip of a legendary ice storm. It began not with snow, but with a cold, relentless rain falling from a slate-gray sky. The temperature hovered just at the freezing point, and every drop that fell froze on contact. For 6 days, the world was coated in a thickening crystal shell. Tree branches sagged and then cracked under the impossible weight, the sound echoing like rifle shots across the valley. Fences disappeared, becoming solid ramparts of ice. The roads became impassable rivers of glass. After the rain finally stopped, the temperature plummeted. The sky cleared, and the mercury dropped to 14 degrees below zero. The valley, beautiful and treacherous, was locked in a state of suspended animation. For the settlers, it was a siege. The immediate danger was not starvation, but the cold. The ice-coated wood was nearly impossible to split, and what could be burned was consumed at an astonishing rate. The battle against the cold became desperate. Inside their cabins, families huddled close to their stoves, feeding them constantly. Yet the chill was inescapable. The walls radiated a deep, penetrating cold that no fire seemed able to defeat. Inside Hannah and Sarah's cabin, the world was different. The silence was the first thing one would notice. There was no wind whistling through invisible cracks. The iron stove glowed with a steady, moderate heat. Hannah was not feeding it every few minutes, but adding a log only every hour or so. The half-cord of wood they had stacked inside before the storm looked barely diminished. The proof of their comfort was in the small, mundane details of life. Sarah sat at the small table, mending a tear in her dress. She was doing it with bare fingers, her needlework precise and untroubled by shivering. On a small shelf near the door, the bucket of water drawn that morning had no skim of ice on its surface. The air was cool, a comfortable 56 degrees, but it was a still dry cool. It was the air of a protected space, not the damp, drafty chill of a shelter under assault. They could hear the constant, frantic chopping of axes from the neighboring claims, the sound sharp and brittle in the frozen air. They knew what that sound meant. It was the sound of men burning through their wood piles at a terrifying rate, the sound of a losing battle. Hannah went to the window and looked out at the glittering, hostile landscape. She touched the wall beside the window frame. It was cool, but it was not cold. It did not feel like a part of the outside world that had forced its way in. It felt like a barrier. It felt like a shield. She thought of the calves in her father's byre, safe and warm, and for the first time she felt a certainty that reached deeper than hope. The wall held. The thaw came a week later, and with it, a return to the communal life of the settlement. Laundry could not wait. The women gathered at the creek ford, their usual meeting spot, a place of work and quiet commerce of news and gossip. The mood was grim. They spoke of the storm, of felled trees and lost livestock. They complained of the cold that had settled deep into their bones, a chill that lingered long after the storm had passed. Their hands, plunged into the near-freezing creek water to rinse the clothes, were cracked and bleeding. Sarah arrived late. Her basket of Hannah's and her own laundry balanced on her hip. She took her place at an open spot on the stones and began her work, nodding a quiet greeting to the others. She did not join their chorus of complaint. There was nothing for her to complain about. The revelation came hours later, after the washing was done, and the women were gathering their things. It was Mrs. Caudle who noticed first. Sarah was folding her dry laundry, not damp, not half frozen, but fully, pliably dry. "You didn't wash that today," Mrs. Caudle stated. It was not a question. It was an accusation. "Yes, I did," Sarah replied calmly, not looking up from her folding. The other women, Mrs. Hale, Mrs. Croft, and the schoolmistress, Miss Albright, drew closer. They looked from Sarah's basket of soft folded linen to their own, filled with stiff, icy sheets that would need to be draped over chairs near the fire for the rest of the day. The contrast was absolute. It was a physical fact that could not be reconciled with their shared experience. "Then where did you hang it to dry?" Mrs. Hale demanded. Sarah finished folding a shirt, her movements unhurried. She looked up and met their gazes. She pointed up the hill. "By the wall?" she said. Mrs. Caudle stared, her mind working, trying to connect the impossible result with its impossible cause. The filthy plaster, the summer-long stench, the foolishness of the Pritchard woman, her certainty, solid as the ice in the creek, began to fracture. "Say that again," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I hung it on a line strung between two pegs," Sarah explained, her voice even and clear, about a foot from the north wall. It was dry by morning. The schoolmistress, a woman who dealt in facts and figures, who understood that cause must precede effect, set her own heavy basket down on the stones. She looked at Sarah's hands, which were chapped but not bleeding. She looked at the soft pillowcase lying on top of the basket. She looked toward Hannah's cabin, where a thin, lazy curl of smoke rose from the chimney, not the thick, panicked plume of a stove being desperately fed. She did not pick her basket back up. The physical evidence before her was too powerful. It proved not only that Hannah's method worked, but that her own knowledge of the world was incomplete. In the silence that followed, a truth settled over the women at the creek ford, cold and clear as the water at their feet. They had been wrong. News of the laundry day miracle spread not like wildfire, but like a slow thaw. It was carried home in baskets of stiff laundry and whispered over dinner tables. It was a story told by women, a domestic proof that was more convincing to the other wives than any argument a man could make about BTUS or cordwood consumption. The men were skeptical, but their wives were insistent. They had seen Sarah's linen. That spring, after the ground dried, Silas Croft's wife, Martha, was the first to act. She asked Hannah for the recipe. Hannah, holding her father's oilcloth notes, gave it freely, explaining the ratios, the curing time, the importance of the thickness. By April, 5 households, including the Crofts and the Hales, had plastered at least one of their cabin's interior walls, usually the north wall that faced the prevailing winter wind. The adoption was not universal. Reverend Yoakum, seeing the trend as a turn toward the profane, delivered another sermon, this time more pointed, warning against pagan earthcraft and the folly of trusting folk wisdom over divine order. He intended to shame the community back to convention. The sermon had the opposite effect. 3 more families, who chafed under the Reverend's stern authority, decided to plaster their walls purely out of spite. If the Reverend was against it, there must be some good in it. The technique began to evolve. Jedediah Hale, having seen the lime's effect, experimented with adding hog hair to the mix for extra tensile strength, a common practice in conventional lime plastering. The innovation was no longer just Hannah's. It was becoming part of the valley's accumulated wisdom. They had mocked what they didn't understand, but survival had a way of humbling even the most certain. They had built walls to fight the wind. Hannah Pritchard had taught them how to build a wall that held the summer. The proof wasn't in a theory, but in the simple, undeniable comfort of a dry sheet on a cold morning. What Hannah Pritchard accomplished in 1864 was a remarkable feat of intuitive building science, anticipating principles that are now central to modern high-performance construction. Her dung and lime plaster was, in effect, an early form of a natural, vapor-permeable, insulated air barrier. Modern builders use sophisticated synthetic membranes and spray foams to achieve what Hannah did with farm waste. The principle of stopping air infiltration is now a cornerstone of energy-efficient design. The fibrous nature of her plaster served the same function as modern materials like dense-packed cellulose or mineral wool, trapping air to create an insulating layer. Today we talk about the importance of thermal mass, and her thick 80-pound per cubic foot plaster was exactly that. A dense material that could absorb and hold the heat from the stove, radiating it back into the room long after the fire died down. The natural building movement of the 21st century, with its focus on materials like cob, straw bale, and light straw clay, is in many ways a return to the very principles Hannah Pritchard deployed out of necessity, memory, and a deep, practical understanding of the materials at hand. In the quiet evenings of that second, warmer winter, Hannah would sometimes stand by the wall, her hand resting flat against its cool, dry surface. She would hold the wooden trowel gauge, its weight familiar in her palm. The central tension of her life had been an unresolved argument with her father, a man she loved, and whose approval she had sought even in defying him. He had called her foolish for wanting to make her own way, for believing she could survive alone on a piece of land that demanded the strength of a man. She had never won that argument with words. He had died before she could prove him wrong. But standing there, in the quiet, steady warmth of her cabin, she understood that the argument was finally over. She hadn't needed to shout. She hadn't needed to persuade. She had simply done the work he taught her, applying his own hard-won knowledge in a way he never imagined. The proof of her wisdom was not in anything she said, but in the very air she breathed. A daughter finished the argument by letting the wall speak for the man who would not. If you found this story of frontier ingenuity as compelling as I did, please consider subscribing to our channel and liking this video. It helps us to continue finding and sharing these lost histories of practical genius. And don't forget to comment below with your own family stories of clever solutions or unconventional wisdom. Thank you for watching. The information presented in this video is for educational and storytelling purposes only. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, though the techniques and principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique, historical or modern, should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.